The cabin of Flight 802 is thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of luxury. But for Carol, the air feels like it's running out. She sits into her dark, elegant locks swept back to reveal the jagged, vein-like scar that maps her temple and neck, a mark of survival that the world treats like a crime. Standing over her is a semicircle of cabin crew members, their black suits sharp, but their expressions dull with prejudice. They don't see a passenger. They see a mistake. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable. In the back of the aircraft, the head attendant whispers, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Your appearance is causing a bit of a stir among the other guests. Or, at the very least, we could provide a blanket for you to cover your face. Carol lowers her gaze to her lap, her fingers tightening on the straps of her modest top. The clock on her dignity is ticking toward zero as she prepares to apologize for existing. But across the aisle, the atmosphere shifts. The temperature seems to drop as Ro-woon leans forward. He doesn't say a word, but the intensity in his dark eyes as he watches the crew's pointing fingers is more terrifying than any threat. He reaches slowly for the onboard telephone, his gaze never leaving Carol's trembling hands. In that moment, the cabin crew has no idea they aren't just insulting a passenger. They are bankrupting their future. The silence of the first-class cabin is brittle, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic tapping of a flight attendant's shoe against the plush carpet. Carol sits perfectly still, her dark, well-maintained locks draped over her shoulder, partially obscuring the light-colored rib top she wore for her interview. However, no amount of styling can hide the textured, vein-like scar that snakes from her temple down her neck, a mark the cabin crew is currently treating like a biohazard. A group of women in identical black professional suits form a judgmental semicircle around her. Their expressions are not of service, but of pure hostility as they point fingers and whisper loud enough for every elite passenger to hear. The lead attendant leans in, her voice a cold hiss, suggesting that Carol's frightening appearance is a disturbance to the cabin and that she should either move to the back of the plane or cover her face with a blanket. As Carol sinks into her seat, the weight of their words pressing against her, she begins to accept the role of the victim, just as she always has. The ticking clock on her dignity is seconds away from midnight. Then the oxygen in the cabin shifts. Directly across the aisle, Ro-woon sits in a tailored black suit that screams authority. His sharp, angular jawline is set in stone, and his intense dark eyes are narrowed, fixed on the crew's pointing fingers with a look of calculated fury. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The sheer power of his presence halts the bullying mid-sentence. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reaches for the onboard telephone. As his groomed eyebrows furrow, the audience is given a silent, cinematic promise. While these women see a monster in Carol's scar, Ro-woon sees a queen. And before this plane touches the tarmac, he's going to make sure this airline loses everything for their blindness. The lead flight attendant didn't even see Ro-woon move. She was too busy sneering at Carol, her finger inches from the young woman's scarred cheek as she prepared to demand Carol vacate her seat. The air in the first-class cabin suddenly felt heavy, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on the back of the attendants' necks stand up. Is there a problem with the passenger's face? The voice was low, melodic, and possessed a terrifying stillness. The crew spun around to find Ro-woon watching them. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back in his leather seat, the crisp white of his cuffs peeking from beneath his tailored black sleeves. His dark eyes, sharp as a glass shard, didn't flicker toward the crew's faces. He looked at their hands, specifically the ones pointing at Carol. The lead attendant stammered, her professional mask slipping. "Sir, we're simply addressing a visual disturbance. For the comfort of the other guests." "I'm a guest," Ro-woon interrupted, his tone chillingly polite. And the only disturbance I see is the lack of class standing in the aisle. Carol looked up, her deep brown eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She saw the way Ro-woon looked at her. It wasn't the fleeting glance of pity she was used to, nor the lingering stare of disgust. He looked at her as if she were the only person on the aircraft who belonged there. Ro-woon reached for the satellite phone in his armrest. He dialed a sequence from memory, his gaze never leaving the lead attendant, whose face was rapidly losing its color. "This is Yun," he said into the receiver. His Korean accent was thick, but his command of the language was absolute. "Withdraw the sovereign wealth investment from Skylink Global now, and contact the board of directors. Tell them I am currently witnessing their cabin crew engage in discriminatory harassment of a high-valued guest." He paused, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips as he watched the lead attendant's personal phone begin to buzz in her pocket. A notification from the corporate emergency line. By the time we touched down in Seoul, Ro-woon continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried through the silent cabin. "I want this airline stock to be worth less than the blanket you tried to use to hide this lady's beauty. And ensure these 3 are blacklisted from the industry. Permanently." He hung up and finally turned his full attention to Carol. The hostility of the crew had been replaced by a frantic, pale-faced panic as they realized their careers were evaporating in real time. Ro-woon reached across the narrow divide, offering a steady, manicured hand. "They are irrelevant now," he told her, his voice softening. "Tell me your name." The wheels hit the tarmac with a violent jolt that mirrored the turmoil inside the cabin. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the usual orderly hum of arrival was replaced by a frantic, hushed energy. The cabin crew, once so poised and superior, now moved with trembling hands and tear-streaked faces. Their tablets were lit up with termination notices and the terrifying news of the airline's plummeting market value. Carol watched them through a blur of confusion, her hands still resting near the place where Ro-woon's presence had offered her shield. She reached for her modest carry-on, expecting to disappear into the crowd of the terminal and find the cheapest taxi to her interview, but the world she knew had already shifted on its axis. "The interview is no longer your priority," Ro-woon said, standing with a fluid grace that commanded the attention of everyone still left in the cabin. He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply stepped into the aisle, creating a path that the disgraced attendants were too frightened to block. The moment the cabin door hissed open, the chaos of the outside world rushed in. Usually, a passenger of Carol's status would be funneled through the standard customs line, but a phalanx of men in sharp, dark suits, identical in intensity to Ro-woon, was already waiting at the end of the jet bridge. They ignored the airport staff and the frantic airline executives who had rushed down to beg for a meeting. Instead, they bowed in perfect unison as Ro-woon approached with Carol at his side. "This way," he murmured, his hand hovering just inches from the small of her back, guiding her toward a private exit that bypassed the swarming terminal. Outside, the gray asphalt was lined with a fleet of 6 identical black sedans, their engines idling in a low, predatory growl. The sunlight glinted off the tinted glass, hiding the power within. Carol hesitated, her fingers tightening on the straps of her overalls as she looked at the opulence before her. She was used to being invisible, a shadow in the corner of a bus or a face hidden behind a mask in a crowded street. Now, she was the center of a storm. One of the men stepped forward, snapping open the door to the lead vehicle. Ro-woon turned to her, his sharp features softening just enough for her to see the sincerity in his dark eyes. "You spent the flight being told you didn't belong in a chair," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the idling engines. "In my world, you don't take taxis. You are the guest of the man who owns the road." As Carol slid into the cool, leather interior of the motorcade, the door closed with a heavy, expensive thud, sealing out the whispers of the world she had left behind. The motorcade swept through massive iron gates that looked more like the entrance to a fortress than a residence. As the black sedans pulled to a stop before the towering facade of the mansion, Carol felt a wave of vertigo. The house was a monolith of glass and dark stone, perched high above the city like a silent guardian. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood and old money, every surface polished to a mirror shine. It was a place designed to intimidate. Yet as she walked through the echoing marble foyer, she realized it wasn't just a home. It was a sanctuary built to keep the rest of the world at a distance. Ro-woon led her past vast, museum-like galleries into a private study where the walls were lined with ancient leather-bound books. The lighting was dim, casting long, dramatic shadows across his sharp features. He paused by a window, looking out over the sprawling estate. For a moment, the mask of the untouchable mafia boss slipped, and Carol noticed something she hadn't seen in the harsh light of the airplane cabin. "You look at me and see power," Ro-woon said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. He began to unbutton his suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't turn around as he let the heavy fabric slide from his shoulders. "You think I was born into this suit, this life. But the world doesn't give power to people like us. We have to carve it out of the wreckage." He turned slightly, pulling the collar of his white dress shirt aside. There, spanning across his shoulder and disappearing down his back, was a jagged, silvered line of scar tissue, a mark far more violent than the delicate, vein-like pattern on Carol's own neck. It was a map of survival, a testament to a past filled with fire and betrayal. Carol caught her breath, her hand instinctively rising to touch her own temple. The fear that had gripped her since the flight began to thaw, replaced by a profound, heavy realization. She wasn't a charity case to him, nor was she a curiosity. "Every mark has a story," Ro-woon murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Mine were earned in the streets. Yours were given to you by people too small to understand your worth. But they're the same thing, Carol. They're the proof that we are still standing when the world tried to break us." In the silence of the gigantic mansion, the distance between the billionaire and the girl in the overalls vanished. For the first time in her life, Carol didn't feel the need to tilt her head to hide her skin. She looked at his scars, then back at his eyes, and finally understood why he had chosen her. They were made of the same unbreakable glass. The dim light of the study seemed to pull the truth from the air as Carol stood before Ro-woon, her fingers tracing the jagged texture of the scar on her neck. She had spent years perfecting the art of silence, but under the weight of his steady, expectant gaze, the words began to spill out like a long-held breath. She told him of a night years ago, not an accident, but an act of calculated cruelty by a family who saw her light as a threat. It was a chemical burn, a gift from a stepmother who wanted to ensure Carol would never stand tall or look a man in the eye. As she spoke, she described the cold laughter that followed the pain and the years of being told she was a broken thing, fit only for the shadows. Ro-woon didn't move. He didn't offer the hollow comforts of a soft man. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal edge against the window. The only sign of his reaction was the slight pulse of a vein in his temple and the way his hands, resting behind his back, clenched until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The warmth Carol had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a temperature so cold it felt like the onset of a winter storm. This wasn't the heat of a sad man. It was the sub-zero precision of a man who was mentally dismantling a target. "Who?" he asked. The word was a single, low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the glassware on the side table. Carol hesitated, her voice trembling as she whispered the name of the woman and the small, corrupt town where her family still lived in unearned luxury. She expected a look of pity, perhaps a gentle pat on the shoulder. But when she looked up, she saw a predator. Ro-woon's dark eyes had turned into obsidian, devoid of empathy, replaced by a terrifying, calculated fury. He wasn't just hearing a story, he was recording a debt. He reached for his phone, his thumb sliding over the screen with a lethal grace. He didn't look at Carol as he spoke into the receiver, his voice a whisper of pure, distilled ice. The woman in Virginia. I want her world stripped bare. Every asset, every home, every shred of dignity she thinks she owns. I want her to feel the air turn cold before she even knows I am coming. He hung up and finally turned back to Carol. The fury was still there, simmering just beneath the surface of his tailored suit, but his touch was surprisingly light as he tilted her chin up to face him. They marked you to hide your beauty, he murmured, his voice thick with a promise of retribution. Now, I will mark the world so they never forget yours. By tomorrow, your past will be a ghost, and the people who hurt you will be begging for the shadows you once lived in. The following morning, the mansion was transformed into a quiet hive of industry. A team of the world's most elite stylists, tailors, and artisans arrived in silence, their eyes widening only for a fraction of a second when they saw Carol's scar before Ro-woon's icy glare snapped them back to attention. They had come prepared with rolls of heavy silk and trays of diamonds, expecting to be asked to camouflage or conceal. But when the lead stylist reached for a high-coverage foundation to mask the textured lines on Carol's neck, Ro-woon's hand intercepted hers with terrifying speed. "You're not here to paint a wall," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You are here to frame a masterpiece. If you hide even a single line of that mark, you will never work in this industry again." Carol stood on the velvet pedestal, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked at her reflection. She was used to baggy clothes and high collars, fabrics designed to act as a shield. But under Ro-woon's direction, the stylist began to drape her in deep, midnight emerald silks that fell away from her shoulder, intentionally drawing the eye toward the vein-like patterns on her skin. They wove delicate gold threads into her dark, twisting locks, making them shimmer like crown jewels. As the hours passed, the shame Carol had carried for a decade began to feel like a foreign weight. She watched as they applied a fine, iridescent dust over the ridges of her scar, not to dull them, but to make them catch the light like a constellation. Ro-woon stood in the corner of the room, a glass of dark liquid in his hand, watching the transformation with the focused intensity of a man building a weapon. When the final garment was fitted, a gown that flowed like liquid obsidian, the room went silent. Carol looked in the mirror and didn't see the broken girl from the airplane or the victim of her stepmother's cruelty. She saw a woman whose history was written in gold and fire. The scar didn't look like a deformity anymore. It looked like a bolt of lightning captured her skin, a mark of terrifying, resilient beauty. Ro-woon walked toward her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. He didn't look at the dress. He looked at her eyes, which finally held the same fire as his own. "They thought they could break you by marking you," he whispered, his hand coming to rest on her bare, scarred shoulder. They didn't realize they were just giving the world a reason to look closer. For the first time, Carol didn't flinch from the light. She straightened her back, her chin high, realizing that the power she had seen in Ro-woon wasn't just in his bank account. It was in the refusal to be ashamed. The peace of the mansion was shattered not by a sound, but by the digital chime of a notification that felt like a cold blade against Carol's skin. While Ro-woon was occupied in a secure wing of the estate, a private message arrived on Carol's encrypted device. It was an image, a grainy, unauthorized photo from the night of the incident years ago, showing her at her most vulnerable, terrified, and bleeding in the hospital. Beneath, it was a message from the lead flight attendant, the woman whose career Ro-woon had ended with a single phone call. "You think you're a queen now?" The text read, dripping with desperation. "But the world deserves to know the truth about the accident that ruined your face. Your boss won't want a liability when he realizes your family didn't just hurt you. They were trying to hide what you really are. Pay me, or this goes to every tabloid in this city." The flight attendant, now blacklisted and starving for vengeance, had spent her final paycheck digging into the dark corners of Carol's history. She believed that by exposing the shame of Carol's past, she could drive a wedge between the girl and the mafia boss, reclaiming some twisted sense of power. Carol felt the old, familiar suffocating weight of the shadows pressing in. Her breath hitched as she stared at the photograph, the image of the broken girl she used to be. For a moment, she considered hiding it, fearing that if Ro-woon saw the raw ugliness of her history, the illusion of her new beauty would shatter. But then, she remembered the gold threads in her hair and the weight of the liquid obsidian gown. She remembered the jagged silver line on Ro-woon's own shoulder. With a hand that only trembled slightly, she didn't reply to the blackmailer. Instead, she walked directly into Ro-woon's study and placed the phone on his desk, the screen still glowing with the threat. Ro-woon picked up the device, his eyes scanning the message with a clinical, terrifying stillness. He didn't look shocked. He looked insulted that someone so small would dare to use Carol's pain as a currency. The air in the room dropped to a sub-zero temperature. "She thinks your past is a weapon," Ro-woon said, his voice a low, lethal hum. He looked up at Carol, his dark eyes burning with a protective fire. "She doesn't realize that in my world, a weapon is only dangerous if you're afraid to use it. She wants a payoff? I'll give her a settlement she'll never forget." He deleted the message with a flick of his thumb, but the fury in his jawline suggested the flight attendant's nightmare was only just beginning. Carol realized then that she didn't have to fear the secrets of her past anymore, not when she had a man willing to burn the world down to keep them safe. The predator's move came during the dead of night, a calculated strike that proved the flight attendant had been nothing more than a pawn for a much larger player. A rival faction, sensing a crack in Ro-woon's legendary composure, had intercepted the blackmail leak and used it to track Carol's movements within the estate. While Ro-woon was lured away to handle a fabricated crisis at the docks, the mansion's high-tech security hummed with a sudden, unnatural silence. The lights flickered and died, plunging the obsidian halls into a darkness that Carol had spent her whole life trying to escape. She was in a library when she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots against the marble. These were not the men in suits she had grown accustomed to. These were ghosts in tactical gear, sent by those who believed Carol was Ro-woon's Achilles heel, a fragile, scarred girl they could use to bring the boss to his knees. But Carol was no longer the girl from the airplane. As she crouched behind a heavy mahogany desk, the iridescent dust on her scars caught the moonlight, shimmering like a warning. She didn't panic. Instead, she remembered the cold weight of the hand-to-hand training Ro-woon had insisted upon during their quiet afternoons. She remembered his voice. "Never be the prey. Even in the dark, you're the one who knows how to hide." When the first attacker entered the room, his thermal goggles sweeping the shadows, Carol didn't wait to be found. She used the very locks they had mocked to snare the man's tactical vest, pulling him off balance with a strength born of years of manual labor and newfound spite. As he fell, she didn't recoil from the violence. She reached for the heavy, gold-edged book on the desk, a gift from Yun, and struck with a precision that echoed the boss's own lethality. Outside, the sound of screeching tires signaled Ro-woon's return, but by the time his men breached the library doors, the scene was already settled. Carol stood in the center of the room, her liquid obsidian gown torn at the hem, her chest heaving with exertion. 3 men lay incapacitated at her feet. Her scar, usually a mark of shame, was smeared with a streak of dust and grit, making her look less like a victim and more like a war goddess. Ro-woon burst into the room, his weapon drawn, his eyes wide with a rare, raw terror for her safety. He stopped dead when he saw her. He didn't see a girl who needed saving. He saw a woman who had survived the coldest war on her own terms. He lowered his gun, a slow, dark smile of pride spreading across his face as he realized his enemies hadn't found his weakness. They had found his equal. The night of the Global Aviation Summit Gala was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the predatory hum of 1,000 camera shutters. This was the territory of the elite, the very people who had spent years looking through Carol as if she were a ghost. The red carpet stretched out like a long, velvet tongue, and at its edge, the world waited for the man who had single-handedly dismantled an airline. But when the door of the lead black sedan opened, it wasn't Ro-woon who stepped out first. It was Carol. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a deafening silence that was more powerful than any applause. She stood in the center of the flashbulbs, dressed in a gown of shimmering, structural silk that mimicked the deep copper of her skin. She hadn't used a single drop of concealer. The vein-like scar on her temple and neck was on full display, catching the gala lights and reflecting them back like a map of lightning. Her dark locks were piled high, pinned with diamonds that sparkled against the textured ridges of her skin. For a moment, the photographers hesitated, their lenses searching for the flaw they had been tipped off about. But as Carol took her first step, her chin held high and her eyes burning with an unbreakable light, the hesitation vanished. The shutters began to fire in a rhythmic, frantic staccato. They weren't capturing a tragedy. They were witnessing a revolution. Ro-woon stepped out beside her, his hand moving to rest firmly on her waist. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked only at her, his expression one of fierce, quiet triumph. The disgraced flight attendant, watching from a screen in a dark room, saw her weapon turn into a crown. The secret was out, but it wasn't a scandal. It was an icon. As they moved toward the entrance, a reporter shouted over the noise, "Carol, who are you wearing?" Carol paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of people who had once made her feel invisible. She felt the warmth of the diamonds against her neck and the strength of the man at her side. But mostly, she felt the power of her own breath. "I am wearing my history," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the roar of the city. "And for the first time, I am not hiding it." By the time she reached the top of the stairs, the images were already circling the globe. Carol was no longer the scarred girl from a viral bullying video. She was the face of a new era, a woman who had turned her pain into a throne. She turned back one last time, her silhouette a masterpiece of survival, and walked into the hall as the most powerful woman in the room. The transition was as swift as it was absolute. Within weeks of the gala, the airline that had once tried to erase Carol's presence was nothing more than a hollow shell, its board of directors pleading for a buyout to avoid total bankruptcy. Ro-woon, moving with the cold, surgical precision that had made him a legend, didn't just buy the company. He dismantled its soul and rebuilt it in the image of the woman who now stood at his side. The morning of the official relaunch, the hangar was filled with the press and the new staff, all of whom had been vetted for a level of empathy that the previous crew lacked. The old, elitist branding was gone, stripped from the fuselages of the long-range jets. In its place was a sleek, minimalist logo that mirrored the graceful, arching lines of Carol's scar, a golden C that stood for resilience rather than status. Ro-woon stood at the podium, his tailored black suit a sharp contrast to the bright, hopeful blue of the new livery. He didn't speak of profit margins or market share. He looked directly at Carol, who stood in a white suit that radiated power, her locks flowing freely and her scar gleaming under the industrial lights. "Legacy is not what we inherit," Ro-woon told the silent crowd, his voice resonating with a rare, public warmth. "Legacy is what we dare to build from the pieces they try to break." This airline used to stand for exclusion. Today, it stands for the beauty of those who survived. With a single movement, they unveiled the name printed in bold, elegant lettering across the nose of the flagship aircraft, the Carol. Carol stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch the cold metal of the plane. She remembered the girl who had sat in first class, trembling and clutching her bags, praying to be invisible. That girl was gone. In her place was the co-chair of a global empire, A woman who had seen her greatest shame transformed into a symbol of international grace. As the first flight of the new legacy prepared for takeoff, Ro-woon leaned in close to her, his breath warm against the very skin her bullies had once called a disturbance. "You aren't just a passenger anymore, Carol," he whispered, his eyes reflecting a great, unshakable pride. "You own the sky." She looked up at the horizon, the sun catching the iridescent dust on her temple. She was no longer defined by the fire that had scarred her, but by the man who had seen her light and the strength she had found to shine it back at the world. The engines roared to life, a powerful, steady hum that signaled not just a departure, but a permanent arrival. Please like and subscribe.